challenges and opportunity. The legislative need for Accessibility Act was articulated by this government's own disability advocate recommendations in 2025, and I did table that document. And let me read you a short quote from page 20 of the Disability Advocates report. Taking a proactive approach to disability and accommodation through legislation would help improve the lives of those with disabilities in all aspects of life, from the built environment to employment. An Accessible Alberta Act would provide clear direction to government departments and industry partners. Now, this was from 2025, before this government decided to roll out a revolutionary new employment program. Their disability advocate released a report saying very plainly, employment needs access. So knowing accessibility legislation would help, because we know that the minister read this report. Instead, the minister hid this report and chose not to share it with the public, and chose not to share it in this House. Now, every province except PEI in Alberta have passed accessibility legislation, some as old as 1978, which is Quebec, la belle province, with the newest being Saskatchewan and New Brunswick in 2023. Like the Accessible Canada Act, Accessible Alberta Act aims to remove, identify and prevent barriers for people with disabilities in the built environment, employment, procurement, transportation, housing, government services, and information technology and communication. We already have human rights legislation, some would say. Alberta Human Rights protects individuals from discrimination in multiple areas like accessibility legislation would. However, the Act is reactionary and doesn't create a duty to accommodate unless a complaint is filed, and that's an important point. As noted in the Disability Advocates report on page 19, and I quote, accessibility legislation is different from human rights legislation, although both play an important and complementary role. Accessibility legislation, while grounded in human rights policy, would take a broader and more proactive approach to access. The Alberta Human Rights Commission Annual Report 2021 also noted support for the accessibility legislation as proposed activities align with the broader advocacy efforts in Alberta, calling for enforceable accessibility standards similar to the laws adopted in most other provinces. Now, using available data from the Alberta Human Rights Commission Annual Report, we can estimate that the average number of complaints involving disability, both physical and mental, are between 45% and 50% of the total complaints year after year after year. Across reports, disability has consistently been the most cited grounds in Alberta human rights complaints, more proof that this accessibility legislation is essential. Now, the federal legislation, Accessible Canada Act, was the model for Accessible Alberta Act, as it was for BC, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, which passed similar legislation after the federal government passed the ACA. The ACA was created in response to our obligations under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The UNCRPD, that's a mouthful, is a thorough document that includes articles about accessibility. Now, while this document was ratified by the Canadian government, it requires federal and provincial governments to enact implementing legislation, and Alberta has failed to do that. Passing an Accessible Alberta Act would help meet Alberta's responsibilities. And I want to remind everyone that this important document is a recognition of the inherent dignity of people with disabilities and enshrining the principle of nothing about us without us. Meaning, all decisions affecting people with disabilities must be based on active engagement and consultation, not a ridiculous online survey that is a box-checking exercise. Now, if you go to page 32 of the Disability Advocates' recommendations to the minister, which he promptly sat on and hid, you will note the Office of the Disability Advocate key undertaking was, and I quote, to understand the potential economic impact of adopting accessibility legislation in Alberta. To do so, the Disability Advocates Office approached Treasury Board and Finance, which in turn produced a report called Contribution of Disabled Albertans to the Alberta Economy. What was interesting to read was that Treasury Board and Finance identified as a barrier that there was insufficient data. We already knew that, Madam Speaker, because this government doesn't keep records about, let's say, how many apprentice seats are filled by people with disabilities, how many people finishing post-secondary education are employed a year later. We have nothing. We have no data. So we heard the Treasury Board say there was insufficient data available to comprehensively access the direct economic impact of accessibility legislation. So the TVF analysis was shifted to the economic contributions of workers with disabilities in the province and the potential economic gain if all Albertans with disabilities had the potential to work, obtained employment. Well, now we know where the minister's half-baked comments come from about the need for ADAPT. They missed an important piece. Yes, there is a large economic gain to be had by all people involved, but you need accessibility to get there. Insufficient or hidden data is what defines the decisions this UCP government is making in terms of disability services, and that needs to change. TVF also reminded us that disabled workers already make significant contributions to our economy, creating 500,000 jobs, generating $29 million in employment income, and adding $48 million to our GDP. Now, Treasury Board and Finance noted that greater accessibility has the potential to increase education and employment opportunities, which may lead to higher incomes and greater GDP gains. This report further revealed that disabled people not currently working but have the potential to work could have significant economic impact by contributing an additional $14 billion to Alberta's economy, $8.5 billion in additional labour income, and creating an additional 158,000 jobs. TVF noted industry would economically benefit from increased accessibility by growing their customer base at home and in the global market. A recent study estimated the benefits of a more accessible Canada could range from $252 to $422 billion in a reference year. To further illustrate this point, I encourage all members to check out the Alberta Chamber of Commerce Policy Recommendation 2025, which calls for an Accessible Alberta Act. They are joining the larger provincial chamber organizations, our chambers from St. Albert, Airdrie, Sherwood Park, Fort McMurray, Medicine Hat, Grand Prairie, Red Deer, Lethbridge, Edmonton, and of course Calgary. Across the Chamber Commerce Network, accessibility legislation is promoted by similar statements of support from communities all across the province. All of these business representing organizations emphasize themes of improving economic participation, increased consumer spending, talent attraction, and expanding labour supply, and of course, they point to the clarity of standards which facilitates progress. Now, the UCP-appointed disability advocate completed his accessibility legislation recommendations to government in a report titled the same in 2025. We need accessibility legislation now. In his own words, I quote, "The risk of not addressing accessibility now is far greater than waiting for a future opportunity." That's unequivocal. The Alberta disability community has been pushing for this legislation for decades. In fact, accessibility legislation was the central pillar of the Premier's Council on the Status of People Premier's Council on the Status of People with Disabilities was first created in the 1980s. The 1980s. That's over 40 years ago. 40+ years later, we've got a council focused on giving inclusion awards, not access. Alberta has a patchwork of complex disability-related legislation and regulation where too many Albertans are left behind. Take this place. ASL is only available during question period, so anyone who is deaf cannot participate in this debate. Alberta Chambers have clearly outlined their support for the Accessibility Alberta Act, and they understand the benefits. This government claims to want to improve unemployment realities for people with disabilities, but they refuse to listen to something or pass something that will actually make that a reality. Alberta Disability Assistance Program without proper accessibility is just a cost-cutting exercise disguised as help. Alberta New Democrats listen to Albertans. We spent the last almost 2 years listening to Albertans about this legislation. We've been listening to them all. We listen to economic and subject experts. We rely on data, science, and lived experience. We know accessibility legislation is essential for our province's economy and well-being.
My apologies, Honourable Member, I may have missed it, but can you just move second reading for me?
Sorry, I move second reading of Private Member Bill 206.
Thank you. Are there any other members wishing to join the debate? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Highlands Norwood.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you so much to that member from St. Albert. I remain in awe of her and her advocacy daily. And yeah, Speaking of remaining very much in awe, I look up at the folks in the gallery who, among them, I won't name them all because there are many who are amazing advocates for the disabled community, and I know there are quite a few watching at home as well, so thank you. You know, when people are critical of us and they say, you know, what's the Alberta NDP actually offering? I want them to think about days like today. Days like today, here we are offering concrete policy, a piece of legislation that would tangibly improve the lives of Albertans, something that somehow nearly every other province across Canada has agreed is critical, and that's accessibility legislation. And yet, here we are. Alberta refuses to even acknowledge the need. They refuse to even consider legislation that would not only help disabled Albertans, but all of us. Because it's clear, when we uplift members of our community, when we uplift one group, we all benefit. Yet instead of, agreeing to engage in healthy, considerate debate, the UCP and the minister responsible will ridicule, will refuse to accept and acknowledge the lived experiences of disabled Albertans. And that's wrong. And so for all of you watching in the gallery and watching at home, you deserve better. And it seems from his prior remarks in question period that this government is not going to be supporting our legislation. I hope I'm wrong, but it's not looking good. People ask me, well, how do we change things like this? Well, it seems the way we change things is by changing this government. So let's go back to this piece of legislation itself. This bill, and that member, I look forward to the member from Morinville St. Albert joining debate instead of heckling me. I look forward to his reasonable, considerate debate because, in fact, I know there's members in this gallery today that are from his riding and that hope that he will support this bill. So I await his comments on this bill. Back to the legislation. Bill 206 aligns with the recommendations made by the UCP-appointed disability advocate in 2023. Yes, you heard that correctly, the UCP-appointed disability advocate. If passed, this bill will require Alberta to introduce accessibility standards that would bring our province in line with other provinces and protect the charter rights of people with disabilities. Bill 206, instead of being reactive, as we've seen in some jurisdictions, is going to take a proactive response. And it's really going to take a comprehensive look at the barriers that folks in the disabled community experience. And as I said, I'm really grateful to that member from St. Albert because one of the things that she does so well is engages with the community. We've all heard the saying, nothing about us without us. That's the mantra from many in the disabled community. And that member from St. Albert isn't just doing amazing engagement, which she is. She's amplifying the voices of community. She's not speaking for folks. She's uplifting and amplifying their voices. And I could share the voices of so many folks who've written us. Today, I opened my inbox this morning, and I was inundated by a number of emails calling on me as the MLA for Edmonton Highlands Norwood to support this bill. And I know that if I'm getting these emails, we all are, and that includes members on the other side. Let's look at some of the comments that folks from the community have said. Voices of Alberta with Disabilities points out that being one of the only 2 provinces in Canada without accessibility legislation puts Alberta at, quote, a critical disadvantage compared to provinces that have taken proactive steps to ensure equal opportunities and access for all. This gap has significant tangible impacts. Individuals with disabilities in Alberta face daily obstacles that restrict access to essential services, fair housing, and even basic physical spaces. Consider the struggles of navigating buildings that lack ramps or elevators, the inaccessibility of healthcare and legal services without ASL, American Sign Language interpreters, or the limited availability of affordable, accessible housing that upholds people's rights to live independently and with dignity, unquote. And folks in this chamber and beyond know that as the Shadow Minister for Housing, I've heard a lot from the community around accessible housing, and the need is greater than ever. And so I really appreciate that piece is included as well. And as the member from St. Albert pointed out, we're talking about the economic impacts here as well. And beyond that, this isn't just about how economically our community could be strengthened. It's also, as voices of Albertans with disabilities point out, it's also a question of equity and justice. And they say Alberta's lack of legislation sends a disheartening message to its residents and those with disabilities that their rights, safety, and well-being are secondary. This must change. They're right. This must change. And to repeat, as I said earlier, if this government isn't willing to support Bill 206 and isn't willing to pass accessibility legislation, well, if we can't change that, then let's change this government. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton-Whiteland.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a pleasure, a great, great pleasure to rise in support of Bill 206, a piece of legislation brought forward by my colleague, the member from St. Albert. Long time in coming, Madam Speaker, and I know that she has done the work to make sure that this legislation reflects just frankly, the standards that Albertans should expect from their government, but that all Albertans can benefit from. I'm really pleased that she's had this opportunity to bring this legislation forward, and I'm very pleased to support it. I know that this is really us doing the work, the pure work of opposition, which is to bring forward the voice of Albertans. The reason why so many of our constituents and many of our MLAs are interested in this piece of legislation, bringing accessibility legislation forward, is because it affects every single constituency in this province. It affects the residents of this province from corner to corner to corner of this province, Madam Speaker. There are over 1 million Albertans who live with a disability every day. Over 27.5% of working-age Albertans report having one or more disabilities. 20% of youth aged 15 to 24 in Alberta have disabilities, 40% of seniors. That means that a vast majority of our population, not almost 1 million people, but then if you add on their families, their caregivers, their supporters, their employers, there are so many people advocating to make sure that Alberta is barrier-free for all Albertans. And the reality, Madam Speaker, unfortunately, is that almost 3/4 of Albertans with disabilities report that they do experience barriers. And that's why Bill 206 is very important. It is to bring forward that legislation to identify and to address those barriers so that all Albertans, including those with disabilities who have every right to thrive, to succeed, to share in the prosperity of this province, and they deserve legislation that is intended to break down those barriers so they can participate fully in every aspect of life like every Albertan deserves to. I want to say that this is truly an act of consultation. This work has been brought forward by the member from St. Albert after working tirelessly, not just over the last 2 years on this particular piece of legislation, but she's tirelessly worked with the disability community as somebody long before she was even in politics, Madam Speaker. This comes from the heart, and it comes from a real need. Now, the member mentioned already, of course, that we are one of only 2 provinces in this country that don't have accessibility legislation. And we have to ask ourselves why, because this piece of legislation doesn't come with a huge price tag, Madam Speaker. This is not anything that's going to cause a huge burden. It's why, frankly, the member was able to bring this forward as a private member's bill, because typically, as we all know, private member's bills can't bring forward pieces of legislation that would have incredible budgetary impact. So there's no financial barriers to bringing forward accessibility legislation. It's actually simply about making sure that we're bringing down barriers for all Albertans. Now, what has been really interesting to me is that over the last 2 years, when the member from St. Albert and others have specifically asked government why they haven't yet acted on the recommendations from the disability advocate, from the disability community to bring forward accessibility legislation, repeatedly over and over what happens is the government stands up whoever is the Minister of Municipal Affairs at the time, to talk about safety codes or building codes. And it reveals, Madam Speaker, that the government either willfully ignores what accessibility legislation is really about, or is for some reason that has yet to be clearly outlined or laid out before this Assembly, is opposed to accessibility legislation. Because if they were to take a look, Madam Speaker, if the government were to take a look at accessibility legislation, national and across other provinces, they'd see that this isn't legislation that's about making sure there's just ramps at buildings. Yes, that's part of it, of course, when we talk about accessibility. That's the piece that everybody thinks about, of course, is the physical access to buildings, and that's one part of it. But why that would only be a concern for the Minister of Municipal Affairs, I completely am confused by that, Madam Speaker. But really, if you look at what other legislation and accessibility standards across the province and across the country have done, they're very varied in terms of what they address. So as the bill itself talks about, it's meant to address transportation and education and health and technology. And I took a look at some of the standards, accessibility standards that have been established by both the national government, the Government of Canada, but also by other provinces. And we'll see that it's not just about physical accessibility to buildings. In fact, in Ontario, under their accessibility legislation, they brought forward standards on customer service. So, for example, requiring staff to have training on serving customers with disabilities, allowing service animals, and handling disruptions. They brought forward standards on information and communications, so requiring websites to follow certain standards so that they can be read and viewed by even those with disabilities. They brought in very significantly, both in Ontario, at the federal level, in Manitoba, in Quebec, and BC, under the accessibility legislation, they brought forward standards about employment, about how to make sure, for example, job postings are accessible, that their hiring and their retention and their recruitment standards meet those accessibility expectations. This is very important and should be very appealing to a government that is trying to move people off of AISH and actually lower their costs of their benefits only so that they can get more work. Well, if they want to get Albertans with disabilities more work, as the member from St. Albert said, they need to create accessibility legislation to make hiring and recruitment and retention more accessible for all Albertans. Other examples of standards that have developed under accessibility legislation include transportation standards, making sure that public transit, buses and taxis are more accessible, designs for public spaces to make sure those spaces and service counters and play areas are more accessible. These are great things. These are great things that make our public spaces, our workplaces, everything more fair for everyone else. I would really encourage the members of the government side to just simply accept that this is a wonderful piece of legislation. There is no downside for them to accept this ability to develop a process by which a consultation can be done to develop these standards. If you look at Bill 206, it sets out a process where a committee is established. That committee is comprised of individuals who are with lived experience with disabilities. They will make recommendations. They will consult with businesses. They will consult with the industries that are affected, the municipal actors, private sector, public sector actors, and then government can do public consultation on these standards. It is a process that is very iterative, that is very expansive, and it's meant to include as many people as possible. That's what this bill does. I really want to hear from the government members why they wouldn't support accessibility legislation. Not only do I want them to stand up and represent their constituents, because all of them have constituents who are living with disabilities, I'd like to hear them talk about those experiences, but I'd really like to hear a thoughtful explanation as to why any government member would not support accessibility legislation. There's no partisanship here, Madam Speaker. There is no, ideological differences here. This is actually fundamentally the core of what government is supposed to do. They're supposed to deliver programs, services, standards to improve the access of all Albertans to the prosperity that we all enjoy. This is not a difficult thing for government to get behind. And maybe, Madam Speaker, we might get to a point where government on this bill just votes against it without even speaking to it. And I hope that doesn't happen. That has happened many times in this legislature before. And you know what? The member from Edmonton-Glenora reminded me it's very possible that government will vote in favour of this. Although I will say the government has had many, many, many years to bring in this legislation. And so their failure to do so, again, I think Albertans with disabilities deserve an explanation as to why they won't bring it forward themselves, or if they're going to vote against this bill, why they're going to vote against it. Yeah. I think that's the least that the government members can do, especially those government members who are ministers, who serve in ministries such as Child and Family Services, such as Assisted Living and Social Services, such as Indigenous Relations, such as all the various health ministers who are constantly on a day-to-day basis, and seniors who deal with individuals who have disabilities. Why would they not support accessibility legislation? It's a pretty simple question, Madam Speaker, and I think that the government members owe that explanation to Albertans. In the meantime, I'm incredibly proud to stand with a government caucus, to stand behind my colleague from St. Albert, who has finally, after a long time, many years, done the work to bring forward legislation that will improve the lives of Albertans. And, Madam Speaker, that is what we are all here to do, and that is what we are very proud to do. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Lethbridge West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, I rise today to support Bill 206 and thank my colleague from St. Albert for introducing this. And I hope the government side will support this as well. Because accessibility is not just for people with disabilities, it's for all Albertans. And in fact, Madam Speaker, this government already supports many of the tenets of this legislation through its support and advocacy for age-friendly communities. And I'm pretty sure most members from the other side aren't aware of this. Bill 206 and age-friendly communities would be housed in the same ministry, assisted living and social services. So, what is age-friendly? Well, for those unfamiliar with the age-friendly movement, let me explain. And this is according to the government's own website. Age-friendly is the idea of making structures and services more accessible and inclusive for seniors with varying needs and capacities. This means looking at how we build infrastructure, the way we get around, and even the way we shop for goods and services. Sounding familiar? Age-friendly communities promote healthy and active aging. People in age-friendly communities are supported in maintaining their independence and have access to the community supports and services they need. Key features of age-friendly communities are things such as well-situated public benches, clean, secure, and accessible public toilets, maintained and well-lit sidewalks, fully accessible public buildings, housing integrated in the community that accommodates changing needs and abilities. Sounding very familiar. Friendly, personalized service and information instead of automated answering services. Public and commercial services and stores in neighbourhoods close to where people live. Madam Speaker, you know, in order to more fully connect Bill 206 with age-friendly communities, which, again, this government fully supports and advocates for, allow me to elaborate with the government's own words. So the checklist for age-friendly communities, it lists essential features of the age-friendly communities developed by the WHO and the age-friendly rural communities. It's a guide developed by federal, provincial, and territorial ministers responsible for seniors. So this provides a guide for communities as they undertake the age-friendly assessment. A lot of the things that I'm going to tell you right now are things that are included in my colleague's legislation. Let's look at outdoor spaces and buildings, such as sidewalks, pathways, and things like that. Sidewalks, pathways are accessible, well-maintained, well-lit, and cleared of snow and ice. Sidewalks are continuous, low curbs, and accommodate mobility devices such as walkers, wheelchairs, scooters, and strollers. Snow removal is prompt and considerate. Consideration is given to how snow is applied for those who need to get in and out of cars, for those who may be using walkers, wheelchairs, scooters, or strollers. Sound familiar? Parking lots are well maintained and cleared of snow and ice. Streets are well maintained. Rain shelters are available to support pedestrians and are accessible for people using mobility devices. Public washrooms are accessible and can accommodate people with a variety of disabilities. This is super important for people that aren't aware. In fact, so important that the Department of Public Health at the University of Lethbridge actually did a survey in Lethbridge about availability of public washrooms for seniors and people with disabilities. And it was quite shocking the lack of those services available to our community. Public washrooms and rest areas are located at convenient locations with proper signage, and they're accessible, and they're available all over. Let's talk about safety and security issues. Programs and policies are in place to support community safety and crime prevention. Neighborhoods and trails are well lit. Let's talk about buildings, because we were talking about something earlier. Our member mentioned and asked a question to the Minister of Municipal Affairs, who talked about codes and things. Well, how about public buildings and businesses are accessible, and they have ramps with appropriate slopes. They have few or no stairs to get into buildings and within buildings, or alternative ways to enter and access buildings. Non-slip flooring, doors that are easy to open, accessible washrooms located on main floors, parking that's well maintained and easy to access. There are also things that we want to look at in communities to make it more accessible, things like grocery stores, churches, government buildings, community centres. Services are grouped together, located in close proximity to where people actually live. Services and stores can be easily accessed. They're located on the ground floor of buildings, including wheelchair ramps, etc. When we talk about roads, we want to make sure that the roads are well maintained. They're well lit and supported by clearly visible signage. We want traffic flow to be well regulated. We need traffic lines on pavement that are clear and visible. Roadways are free of obstruction that could block drivers' visions. Traffic signs in intersections are visible and well placed. Pedestrian crossing controls allow adequate time for people with limited mobility to cross. Parking lots and street parking are located close to amenities. Parking regulations are enforced, that is, preventing people from parking in emergency zones and parking spaces for persons with disabilities. And make sure there's sufficient numbers of parking spots for persons with disabilities. Parking and drop-off areas are made safe and sufficiently marked. In fact, Madam Speaker, in the City of Lethbridge, new parking lot design ensures that there are parking spots, full parking spots on each side in the disability parking sections. We talked about snow removal already, but what about transportation? Accessible, affordable, and convenient public transportation options are available. Public transportation services are clear, well-marked routes and vehicles. Public transportation services are reliable and frequent and meet the needs of citizens. Vehicles used for public transit are clean, well-maintained, accessible, not overcrowded, and have priority seating that's respected. Where public transportation is limited, volunteers and/or private transportation services are available. Affordable and accessible community transportation services are available to take citizens to medical appointments, shopping excursions, and community events. Affordable and accessible community transportation services are available to take citizens to appointments and events in larger centres. And remember, this is about age-friendly communities, Madam Speaker. This isn't just about people with disabilities, but this is exactly what this legislation speaks to. Accessible transportation for persons with a variety of disabilities, including mobility challenges, is available across a range of transportation services. And what about things like information? And I think that's addressed as well in this legislation. A range of appropriate and affordable information is provided to seniors and persons with disabilities in alternate formats, including large print, about the range of transportation services, both public and private, available to them, including information on how and where to access them, schedules, and fees. The use of public and alternative transportation is promoted in the community, so people actually know what's available. Let's talk about housing really quickly. A range of appropriate and affordable housing options, including sale and for rent, are available, such as apartments, independent living, smaller condominiums, and family homes. Housing is located in close proximity, again, to public, commercial, and religious services. Housing options, including houses and apartments, are available that are responsive to local needs, including the needs of seniors, people with disabilities, and young families. So, aging in the right place, and we've talked about this before, but I want you to understand how this also affects people with disabilities. Because one of the issues that we're dealing with an aging population right now is an aging disabled population. So we're dealing with not only people with disabilities, but people that are aging. And so let's think about this. Home support should be available to enable older Albertans to live at home. Systems are in place and available to assist citizens who live alone who may have mobility or health challenges. Housing modifications are available and affordable with financial assistance providing those on fixed incomes. New housing is built to accommodate individuals and families of different life stages and or to allow people to adapt to their homes to meet changing needs. New housing is encouraged to consider principles of universal design. For example, interior spaces have even surfaces and are wheelchair accessible and are to allow freedom of movement in all rooms and passageways, and information on financial assistance programs for home modifications is readily available and easily accessible. One of the things that this legislation also speaks to is social participation. So in order for people with disabilities to engage in our communities, there needs to be a range of events.
Are there others to join the debate? The Honourable Member for Calgary-Falconridge.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today in strong support of Bill 206, the Accessible Alberta Act. This bill is not only overdue, it is urgent. It represents a chance to finally build on Alberta, where people with disabilities can live, work, learn and participate fully in our society without facing constant preventable barriers. It is also a chance to address an affordability crisis that is hitting Albertans with disabilities harder than anyone else. For several long years, the UCP government has failed to act on accessibility. Alberta remains one of only 2 provinces with no accessibility legislation at all. And this inaction has allowed physical, social, and economic barriers to stack up while the cost of living has exploded. Madam Speaker, this bill is about dignity. It is about fairness, and it is about ensuring that Albertans with disabilities are not going to be asked to pay more, struggle more, and wait longer for the sports every person deserves in a province like ours. There is an affordability crisis for Albertans with disabilities. Madam Speaker, Albertans across the province are struggling under the weight of rising costs. But for Albertans with disabilities, the affordability crisis is not simply a challenge, it is a compounding emergency. The price of rent, groceries, utilities, transportation, medications, and insurance have reached historic highs. Yet, despite the clear evidence of mounting financial strain, this government chose to freeze AISH for more than 3 years during the period of highest inflation Alberta has seen in decades. It also clawed back the federal Canada Disability Benefit, removing $200 per month from the pockets of Albertans already living in deep poverty. It then forced thousands onto the new ADAP program without any consultation, a move that undermined stability and violated the basic principle of nothing about us without us. The truth is that people with disabilities face unavoidable additional costs that those of who don't have. Never have to think about assistive equipment, medications, mobility sports, specialized transportation, home modifications, and informal caregiving, all of which increase in price during an affordability crisis. At the same time, they face greater barriers to employment and lower average earnings. As costs rise, they feel the impact disproportionately because every increase combines with the extra expenses they already carry. Madam Speaker, we have seen this was previous bills. With Bill 210, that was introduced by the member of Edmonton Millwoods, revealed the disproportionate harm faced by the workers in low-wage service jobs, and Motion 504, brought forward by the member of Edmonton Southwest, demonstrated how unchecked automobile insurance premiums have crushed families already burdened by rising costs across every aspect of life. The accessibility crisis similarly intersects directly with the affordability crisis as Albertans with disabilities and those who care for them. And now, Bill 206, introduced by the member for St. Albert, highlights how Alberta's absence of accessibility legislation, leaving us one of the only two provinces without such a framework, amplifies the financial strain on Albertans with disabilities. These Albertans already face higher day-to-day costs and systematic barriers that make essential goods and services more expensive and more difficult to access. For Albertans with disabilities, these two crises do not simply overlap. They reinforce one another. Rising prices worsen the impact of existing barriers, and those barriers, in turn, magnify the financial pressure caused by rising prices. The result is a compounding affordability burden that grows heavier every year this government fails to act. And then there is a government's failure to act. Madam Speaker, the UCP government received a comprehensive accessibility report from its own appointed disability advocate in 2023. That report contained detailed recommendations on how to establish proactive accessibility legislation. Rather than act, the government ignored it for 2 years until advocates forced the report's release through a FOIP request. During the government's delay, the affordability crisis deepened significantly. Basic costs rose rapidly. Sports remained frozen. Rents spiked. Food prices climbed. Insurance premiums surged. Albertans with disabilities were left to shoulder these increases without any meaningful relief. Inaction in the face of such a crisis did not merely maintain existing barriers. It amplified them, leading to greater poverty, financial instability, and forced reliance on food banks and charitable organizations. The consequences of inaction are not theoretical. They are felt every day in every community. And Madam Speaker, Bill 206 transitions Alberta from a reactive, complaint-driven system to a proactive, standards-based model of accessibility similar to the systems already implemented in 8 other provinces. This bill establishes an Accessibility Standards Committee and ensures that a majority of its members are people with disabilities, including Indigenous representation. The committee will be required to consult with disability organizations, Indigenous communities, municipalities, businesses, agencies, and other impacted groups. It is tasked with developing accessibility standards across a range of essential areas, including government services, transportation, employment, education, housing, and communications. Once the committee develops these standards, the government will be required to adopt them through regulation, moving the province toward the goal of a barrier-free Alberta by 2040. In the current affordability crisis, the proactive approach matters because every barrier removed is a cost removed. When workplaces are accessible, people have better opportunities to earn income. When government services are accessible, people spend less time and money navigating complicated systems. When buildings and transportation systems are accessible, people are not forced into expensive alternative arrangements just to participate in daily life. Accessibility is not only a human rights issue, but also a key component of affordability. Madam Speaker, more than 1/4 of Albertans, 27.5%, live with at least one disability, and that number has grown significantly in recent years. These Albertans are essential contributors to our province. In 2021 alone, 390,000 Albertans with disabilities were employed, making up 17% of the workforce. Their work generated $29 billion in employment income and contributed $48 billion to Alberta's GDP. However, despite their contributions, they continue to face higher levels of unemployment and underemployment than any other group. They also bear the highest levels of hidden costs, from assistive devices to additional caregiving needs, which grow heavier when costs rise. Improving accessibility directly improves affordability and labor force participation. Treasury Board and Finance estimate that closing the disability employment gap nationally could add up $50 billion to Canada's GDP. When people can work, participate, and access the sports they need, they contribute more to the economy and rely less on emergency sports. This benefits families, communities, and the entire provincial economy. And Madam Speaker, stakeholders across the province have expressed strong support for accessibility legislation. The Alberta Chambers of Commerce has called for accessibility legislation with clear, measurable outcomes because businesses understand the economic benefits of inclusion, especially during times of labour shortage. Disability organizations such as Voice of Albertans with Disabilities and Barrier Free Alberta have advocated tirelessly for proactive legislated accessibility standards. Their years of advocacy underscore the urgent need for government action, especially now as the affordability crisis continues to deepen. Madam Speaker, Alberta's New Democrats believe deeply in inclusion, fairness, and affordability.
The honourable member for Camrose.
I want to begin by acknowledging the intent behind Bill 206 and the genuine passion of the member opposite who brought it forward. Accessibility matters. The full and equal participation of Albertans with disabilities in every aspect of life in this province is not a partisan issue. It is a shared value in this chamber. I want to be clear about that from the onset because what I'm about to say is not a rejection of that vision. It is a rejection of the way this bill proposes to get us there. Mr. Speaker, let me start with what is working and what is actively changing. Alberta is not standing still on accessibility. Earlier today, Alberta's government announced that through Budget 2026, we're investing an historic $3.7 billion to support Albertans with disabilities this year alone. That is a year-over-year increase of nearly $100 million. Since 2019, we have increased annual investment in disability supports by more than $1 billion, a nearly 40% increase. These are not talking points, these are commitments, backed by real dollars, reaching real Albertans. Alberta has the highest employment rate for persons with disabilities in this country at 53%, and the highest hourly earnings for employed persons with disabilities at more than $33 an hour. Through Budget 2026, we are investing an unprecedented $250,000 to help Albertans gain and retain meaningful employment, including enhanced supports for Albertans with disabilities through Work First Alberta and specific disability-related employment supports. These are supports that are flexible, person-centred, and focused on breaking down barriers so that folks can achieve long-term success. As for the built environments, which is often at the heart of accessibility conversations, we are making real, measurable progress. A new edition of the Alberta Building Code came into force on May 1st, 2024, introducing updated accessibility and safety requirements for all new construction and major renovations. In October 2024, we released an update accessibility design guide to help designers build in municipalities not just meet minimum code requirements, but adopt best practices that exceed them. Our building and safety codes require barrier-free access in public buildings. Multifamily residential buildings must provide accessibility in common areas, lobbies, hallways, elevators, and entries. And municipalities enforce these standards as the authorities have jurisdiction under the Safety Codes Act. The province's affordability housing portfolio actually exceeds those standards, with 14% of units being barrier-free, well above the 10% code requirement. And when we look at the new affordable housing builds currently underway, Alberta is once again on track to exceed accessibility requirements. Alberta also has the most robust suite of disability programs in the country. Record funding for AISH, the new Alberta Disability Assistance Program, supports for adults, children and families with disabilities, and Disability Advocates Office, supports for accessibility upgrades to residences for persons with disabilities, service dogs, supported transportation, and specialized service delivery networks across the province. Now the members opposite may suggest that because we do not currently have a single standalone piece of accessibility legislation, we are somehow behind. That implication, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, does not hold up. Only 3 provinces in this entire country, Ontario, Manitoba, and Nova Scotia, have fully developed accessibility standards, and the results have been sobering. Ontario's most recent independent review found that accessibility in that province has reached what the reviewers called a crisis point. Non-existent enforcement, limited accountability, fragmented oversight, and insufficient data. A single piece of legislation did not solve the problem in many ways. It created new ones because it wasn't doing it right. Mr. Speaker, or Madam Speaker, I do not want that for Alberta. Currently, Alberta was embedded accessibility requirements across multiple frameworks, including the Human Rights Act, the Safety Codes Act, the Building Code Act, and our programs and services that provide real enforceable projections that are actively being strengthened. And we are committed to continuous improvement in accessibility informed by Albertans with disabilities. Accessibility experts and advocacy organizations participate directly in the Safety Codes Council's Barrier-Free Sub-Council. We work with national partners through the Canadian Board for Harmonized Construction Codes and the National Research Council. In 2024, we signed a 5-year memorandum of understanding with Accessibility Standards Canada to strengthen collaboration on accessibility standards for the province. In fact, the Ministry of Municipal Affairs has already begun engagement on the development of broader accessibility standards and legislation. That work is underway. It is being done thoughtfully, collaboratively, and with the people who will be most affected by it, including Albertans with disabilities. Madam Speaker, looking at the piece of legislation before me, the challenges with this bill are too substantial to address through amendments. Let me walk through the key concerns. First, this is the most fundamental issue. The bill would cede control of the creation of the building accessibility standards to a small, unelected body of 6 to 10 people. This committee would have the authority to develop standards covering employment, the built environment, IT, government services, housing, transportation, health, education, and procurement. Building the provincial government to every municipality, every employer, every building owner, every transit provider, and every goods and services provider in Alberta. And yet, the legislation is incredibly prescriptive about who sits on that committee in a way that severely limits representation from the very sector that would bear the cost and responsibility of implementation. There is no requirement for healthcare representation on the committee empowered to set health standards. There is no formal economic impact assessment required. There is no provision for mitigated costs of implementation for small businesses or nonprofits. Madam Speaker, when we are talking about standards, what could require physical modifications? New policies and new technologies across every corner of this province. We need the people responsible for implementation at the table. This bill does not ensure that. Second, the breadth of definitions and powers is extraordinary. As drafted, this would be among the farthest-reaching accessibility legislation in the country. Ambition is not a flaw, but ambition without adequate structure and flexibility is a recipe for exactly the kind of failure we have seen in other jurisdictions. Third, the bill is far too prescriptive. It leaves almost nothing to regulation. The committee make up what standards should include, reporting requirements, review timelines. Nearly everything is locked into statute. It provides no opportunity to course correct as we go. If something is not working, we would have to recall the legislature and pass amendments to fix it. Good governance, especially on legislation, this expansive leaves room to adjust the regulation. This bill does not. Fourth, the wording in several places is unclear. The definition of disability, for instance, is broad enough to create genuine uncertainty about scope and application. Legislation that affects every Albertan and every organization in this province must be precise. And finally, the bill creates red tape by establishing multiple new administrative structures with remunerated members, layering costs upon top of the existing mechanisms in place to identify and address accessibility barriers, such as Alberta's Disabilities Advocate and the Premier's Council on the Status of Persons with Disabilities, which have proven very effective. Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, pardon me, I want to close where I started. We share the vision of a strong, accessible province where all Albertans are empowered to reach their full potential. We are committed to continuous improvement, informed by Albertans with disabilities, and we are acting on that commitment with historic investments, with updated building codes and design guidelines with national partners, and with engagement already underway on the development of accessibility standards and legislation. But the way to honour that commitment is to get this right, not to rush forward with a bill that concentrates enormous power in a small, unelected body without adequate representation. That locks every detail into statute with no room to adapt, that carries unclear definitions, and that layers new bureaucracy on systems already in place and delivering real results. We owe it to Albertans with disabilities to do this properly. We owe it to the organization, employers and municipalities that supports them.
The honourable member for Edmonton-McClean.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to rise to speak to Private Member Bill 206, proudly brought forward by a member for St. Albert, who has been a tireless advocate for people with disabilities in this province throughout her whole career as an MLA and beyond that, before her election to this legislature. And I must say, Madam Speaker, it was a painful 10 minutes that I just spent listening to the member for Camrose squirming and flailing and trying to justify this ad hoc approach to disability legislation that the government has in place right now. If indeed the story that the member for Camrose was telling about the government's success, so-called success, in addressing issues with respect to accessibility in this province, then in fact the need for this Bill 206 would not be there. But in fact, the reason we're bringing forward this bill, Madam Speaker, is because the need is dire. And I can only imagine, Madam Speaker, what the folks in the gallery, members of the audience at home as well, who are speaking tirelessly and as advocates for accessibility legislation, what they're thinking now as they hear the government's response in an attempt to downplay the need for this accessibility legislation. I can only think that they would be really, really difficult for them to listen to the government saying everything's fine, aren't we doing great? And then they go ahead and try to downplay the need for a systematic, universal, overarching approach to disability legislation. Accessible Alberta Act, it demonstrates that an ambitious, far-reaching and prescriptive piece of legislation is necessary, and the member for Camrose says that it leaves no room for regulation. Well, I'll tell you what, Madam Speaker, it leaves no room for successive UCP governments to wiggle out of actually being bound to accessibility legislation, and that's why the legislation is prescriptive, because this is not a negotiable item, Madam Speaker. Accessibility for those with disabilities, whether it be physical or mental, is absolutely a human right and has not been recognized in this province with the current legislation that we have now. Now, I would imagine that the member for Camrose and others in the legislature on both sides of this House, given that the percentage of Albertans who suffer from disabilities and have accessibility issues is around 27%, so that's 1 in 5 actually have a mental or physical disability. So it's probable to believe, Madam Speaker, that everybody in this House is directly associated with somebody, probably more than one, probably many people who have physical or mental disabilities. So to hear members opposite tell us that they're not planning to support this legislation, which one would have thought would have been a no-brainer to support, is really disheartening, because they are telling people to the right and to the left of them, and to those loved ones around them, they're telling their friends and neighbors from across the street in their hometowns right across this province that they matter less than everybody else who may be able-bodied. And this legislation, Madam Speaker, is long overdue in this province, and we're proud to bring it forward and to make sure that those folks with disabilities are respected in the same way that able-bodied people are. And even though, yes, Madam Speaker, it may end up costing our society more to bring forward these new measures, whether it be in building codes, whether it be in transportation, whether it be in active transportation, whether it be in the workplace adjustments. People deserve that, because the return on the investment, Madam Speaker, is huge. And I don't know why the government doesn't understand that, even in the simple economic terms. Everybody in this legislature can speak to their own lived experience and understanding of how they visualize people with disabilities living on a daily basis. But try, if one might, to think about your local experiences and ask all MLAs to do this. For example, I can speak to my own constituency where there's a major housing development called West Edmonton Village. You cannot find a wheelchair accessible suite in there, and there are people who are managing to make do with a washroom that's not accessible by having family members assist them in the washroom in their own residence, because that's the only affordable residential accommodation they can find. In my own building where my office is located, they did a renovation in the Collingwood Professional Centre, but they failed to make the bathrooms accessible. So just last week, Mr. Speaker, I ended up having to open the doors and hold them open for an individual who was using a wheelchair, couldn't get out of the bathroom, Mr. Speaker, because the building, which is a fairly modern building, doesn't allow for wheelchairs to get through a double door system. That's the kind of thing that we're trying to address here, Mr. Speaker, but the member for Camrose on the other side seems to tell us that this legislation isn't necessary. Well, I'll tell you what, it is necessary. We haven't gone anywhere near far enough to make sure that there's no excuse for a building manager or a building owner not to, especially when they're doing renovations, not to involve themselves in talking to the disability community and making sure that those renovations absolutely meet the needs of people with disabilities. Basically, the principle should always apply right across the board, Mr. Speaker. Nothing about us without us. Nothing about us without us. And if you're going to do some renovations, make sure that you've talked to people who are most affected by those renovations. That's people with disabilities. And you'll find that they are more than eager to spend the time to let it be known how they could be helped, so they can participate just as fully as you and I would in our society, whether it be at work, going to recreation, or going to school, or in residential accommodations. Well, I know from my experience, Mr. Speaker, as a realtor for 30 years, how extremely difficult it was even 10 years ago when I last sold real estate to find accessible accommodation for people who wish to either rent or to buy their own. And this stems from the fact, Mr. Speaker, that when you do an area structure plan or a neighborhood structure plan, that the legislation doesn't require, to the depth that it should, the construction of accessible units to a percentage or degree that meets the needs of the population of people with disabilities. Individuals with disabilities have a right to be able to expect that they can buy or rent in any neighborhood that they wish to locate in, or even in a residential community that's outside of a major metropolitan area. In a small town, there should be a requirement there be accessible accommodation right throughout the province of Alberta. This isn't a cost, Mr. Speaker. This is an investment in 25% of our population who simply want to share the same rights as the rest of us, to be able to live, work, and go to school and raise a family and be accommodated in the way that all of us have expectations as able-bodied people. So another topic that the member for Camrose might want to address is transportation, accessible transportation, Mr. Speaker. I've talked about this in the legislature a lot of times, and I mean, this government wants to encourage folks who are disabled to go to work, making it easy for people to go to work. We're taking them off AISH, and we're going to go get them involved in the ADAP program, and we're going to cut their benefits, but they have the right to work. Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, those jobs don't exist for the most part. And secondly, how are they going to get there? Like, once you leave your inaccessible housing unit and you go to the street, if you're in rural Alberta in particular, where are you going to go? There's no bus. You can't go from one community to another. Greyhound disappeared in 2018, Mr. Speaker, and there's been no real replacement except for a few of the larger companies that will make money on the gravy routes where they're heavily populated. But try taking a bus from High Level to Vauxhall, Mr. Speaker, or any community in between if you want to travel from one community to another, especially if you're a disabled person. Like in a municipality, you may have some form of DAT system, disabled adult transportation in Edmonton, Calgary, and the larger centres, Lethbridge and so forth. But there are, even in some of our larger centres, are pretty much ad hoc, potentially run by volunteers, and they come forward and then they fail after 6 months or a year. And there's no reliable, accessible transportation opportunities or options for people in this province to be able to get to and from work, or to travel for vacation, or to go to school. And this, Mr. Speaker, is not something that is going to be remedied by this government's ad hoc method of addressing the situation of people with disabilities in this province. We need Bill 206 to cover, in a very universal way, the needs.
Any others wishing to speak? I will recognize the member for Edmonton South.
Mr. Speaker, I'm immensely proud to stand in full support of Bill 206, put forward by my amazing colleague, the member for St. Albert, whose relentless, passionate and heartfelt advocacy has brought forth this long-needed legislation. If passed, this bill will require Alberta to introduce accessibility standards that will bring Alberta in line with other provinces and protect the charter rights of people with disabilities. For far too long, Albertans with disabilities have been asking and waiting for this UCP government to take meaningful action to remove the barriers that prevent them from participating fully without barriers in our province. So my question is, why did the UCP take 7+ years and counting to even consider potentially creating accessibility legislation? The members opposite talk about taking their time to carefully put together legislation. But, Mr. Speaker, 7+ years and counting and still nothing? Currently, Alberta has a patchwork of policies and legislation that address disability on an issue-by-issue basis, including legislation like the Alberta Human Rights Act that creates frameworks for adjudicating complaints without barriers. After 7 years of this UCP government, Alberta remains one of only 2 provinces in Canada without any accessibility legislation. This is simply unacceptable. But with Bill 206, we can finally offer a better path forward, because this bill takes the proactive, standards-based approach used successfully in 8 other provinces in this country. And instead of the reactive, complaint-driven system Albertans are currently forced to navigate, Bill 206 focuses on identifying, preventing, and removing barriers before they cause harm. And this is integral, Mr. Speaker, because this approach is based on dignity, efficiency, and respect. Bill 206 sets a goal of a barrier-free Alberta by 2040, putting Alberta in alignment with Federal Accessible Canada Act and jurisdictions across the country. To do so, this bill establishes an Accessibility Standards Committee whose majority must be people with disabilities, because accessibility legislation must follow the simple guiding principle of nothing about us without us. For far too long, people with disabilities have been shut out of policy making that directly affects their lives, and this bill corrects that by ensuring that the committee must include people with disabilities, Indigenous representation, the advocate for persons with disabilities, and representative of the Premier's Council on the Status of Person with Disabilities. And importantly, the committee must consult widely with disability organizations, Indigenous peoples, municipalities, businesses, government agencies, and much more. We need this legislation more than ever, Mr. Speaker. Not only has this UCP government failed to bring in accessibility legislation, they have actively made life harder and more expensive for people with disabilities in Alberta, in fact, for all Albertans. It is this UCP government that cut and de-indexed AISH, forcing people with disabilities to shoulder the full burden of inflation. It is this UCP government who clawed back the Canada Disability Benefit, snatching federal support from some of the poorest Albertans. It is this UCP government that forced thousands onto the new ADAP program without consultation, stripping supports and creating confusion and hardship overnight for thousands of Albertans. Tens of thousands of Albertans were left now unsure how they will pay for basic necessities. Cutting income supports after years of high inflation is nothing short of cruel, and prioritizing cost savings over livelihoods of Albertans with disabilities is unconscionable. It is heartbreaking that the members opposite hear that Albertans living with disabilities have even considered medical assistance in dying because they feel abandoned and frightened by the actions of this UCP government. And to make matters worse, when the UCP's own advocate for persons with disabilities recommended comprehensive accessibility legislation in 2023, the government buried that report for years. Shame. It only became public because a disability advocate filed a FOIP request. And after that, the government still did nothing, Mr. Speaker. Clearly, this UCP government is not focused on building accessibility in Alberta. But on this side of the House, the Alberta New Democrats will make life more affordable and accessible for Albertans with disabilities. And we will do that by always consulting Albertans with disabilities about the decisions that directly affect their day-to-day lives. I want to remind the members opposite that accessibility is not only a human rights issue, but it's an economic opportunity. In 2022, more than 27% of Albertans were living with at least one disability. People with disabilities comprise approximately 17% of Alberta's workforce, contributing nearly $48 billion into Alberta's GDP in 2021 alone. But too many still face barriers that prevent them from working or accessing services. More than 1 million working-age Canadians with disabilities want to work, but are sidelined by preventable barriers. Many employers still believe people with disabilities are less productive, more prone to absenteeism, or costly to accommodate, despite evidence showing otherwise. These misconceptions lead to unconscious bias during hiring and promoting decisions. And what is this government even doing to handle that issue with jobs? 68% of job seekers with disabilities report facing obstacles during recruitment, including inaccessible online applications, assessment tools, and interview platforms that don't work with assistive technologies like screen readers. This has led to nearly half of disabled Albertans remaining out of work while they grapple with a government that has not invested in accessibility or job creation in for this community. Closing the disability employment gap could increase Canada's GDP by up to $50 billion. And this means that businesses and workers stand to see major benefits through accessibility measures in this bill. The Alberta Chambers of Commerce explicitly called for an Accessibility Act in 2025 with measurable outcomes and phased implementation. But because a barrier-free Alberta means a stronger and more inclusive job market, this is important, Mr. Speaker. While Bill 206 isn't able to reverse the UCP's government's harmful cuts to AISH, undo the damage caused by the ADAP rollout, or fix the hidden wait lists or frozen intakes for vital support programs, it does create a proactive, community-led foundation required to finally build an Alberta where people with disabilities are not forced to fight for basic access and inclusion. It supplements an Alberta Human Rights Act by shifting from a reactive model where people must file complaints after their rights have been violated towards a forward-looking model where barriers are identified and removed in advance. And this is long overdue, Mr. Speaker. Standards developed under this Act could transform accessibility, employment, infrastructure, information and technology, housing, education, procurement, and so much more. These are the everyday systems Albertans rely on to live, work, partake in schools, and to fully participate in society. When those systems contain barriers, people are excluded. Alberta's New Democrats firmly believe in a province where everyone can participate fully and with respect and dignity. We believe in affordability, accessibility, and genuine consultation. We believe that policy should be built with the people it affects, not forced on them. And this is why we fully support Bill 206. This bill also brings Alberta closer to meeting our charter obligations. It brings us in line with every other major jurisdiction. And most importantly, it brings hope to thousands of Albertans with disability. It is not a privilege, accessibility, it's a right.
Thank you. Any others wishing to speak? I will recognize the member for Edmonton Riverview.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it's my pleasure to add my voice to the debate on Bill 206, the Accessible Alberta Act, brought forward by my colleague from St. Albert. And, you know, we've really, and many of my colleagues already having spoken have identified this, but we're so grateful to the MLA from St. Albert for her extensive work, her expertise in this area. Previous to being elected, she was the executive director of LOSICA, which is an advocacy organization for persons with disabilities. So this has been her life's mission, really. And you know, her contributions and her fighting for people with disabilities in our province has really given them a strong voice, and I look forward to when we are government and she can continue doing that and we can make the decisions. I also just want to say that, you know, I used to be the Minister of Seniors and Housing, and right now I'm the Shadow Minister for Seniors, Continuing Care and Home Care. And we have 875,000 seniors in our province, and that population is about 16% of the total population. And by 2031, 1 in 5 people in Alberta will be a senior. And of course, I'm among them because I turned 65 back in January. And so I'm proud to say I'm a senior. And spring chicken. I'm a spring chicken, according to this senior. So thank you for that. I don't know, not too many people call me a spring chicken anymore. That's from the member for Calgary Buffaloes telling me, oh, you're Buffalo, yes. We used to be Mountain View, yes. Buffalo. Yes. Anyway, but for sure, as we age, our bodies do wear down. There's just no question about that. And so I just am bringing up the fact that as our population ages, you know, we have to be a more sensitive society and make sure that there is accessibility and support for people who have issues with mobility. And so that's why Bill 206 is so important, because that will ensure a comprehensive programs and plans to make sure that our aging population is supported. And, you know, personally, again, I'll just share that, you know, I've got osteoarthritis in my knees, and at the moment, I seem to be able to still navigate okay, and I try to exercise lots to support myself to be strong, but I'm sure there'll be a time when, you know, going upstairs will just be prohibitive for me. So, and I know that there's many people who already have those difficulties. So making sure that people with mobility issues have access, because we know that that's so important for people to be included in our society. And we already have so many issues with social isolation in the seniors population. And we know that when seniors are isolated for many different reasons, but mobility can be one of them, this legislation would definitely support people to be more connected in their communities, because there wouldn't be the barriers to that, like the member from Edmonton McClung was talking about, whereas in his new building even, you know, people can't even go to the bathroom. People aren't being supported to live in dignity if they happen to be in a wheelchair. And that shouldn't be happening. In a rich province like Alberta, and another thing I just want to say is, Alberta is one of 2 provinces that does not have accessibility legislation. And the other province is PEI. And I mean, PEI is, you know, our smallest province, a very low population, and you know, every province, every territory should have this type of legislation. But you know, a rich province like Alberta, with, you know, 5 million people in our population, it's ridiculous that we don't have any comprehensive accessibility legislation. And that's why this bill is so important. And I'm so pleased that the member from St. Albert brought it forward, because it's long overdue. It's long overdue that we have this legislation. And I guess I just want to say on another personal note is that my mom lives in a continuing care facility. She's 89. And, you know, I'm her daughter, so I have osteoarthritis, but I got it from her. She has significant mobility issues, and currently she's in a very difficult situation because she lives in a 4-story continuing care, and there's stairs and there's 1 elevator. And right now that elevator's not working. And they said, well, it's not going to work for 3 weeks. And so my mom is stuck on the 4th floor for the last 3 weeks, and she just physically cannot go down those stairs. She said she tried to go down 1 floor and then had to, you know, be supported to come up again. And it was so difficult for her. I mean, this is a short-term thing. I mean, there is an elevator in that facility, but I mean, it's significantly changed her life over these 3 years, and so we've been checking in with her a bit more. But I mean, you know, if there isn't accessibility for people, I mean, it's a significant barrier for people to be able to be engaged. You know, my mom, like, she's one of those gals, she's a school teacher for many years. She gets her hair done every Friday. She does it, like, after school is over on Friday, she'd always go get her hair done, and she still does. But this 3 weeks she can't, and I know that that bothers my mom, because she really likes to get her hair done. So, so that's one of the things she's had to give up. But anyway, this is just sort of some impacts on what happens when people don't have abilities to be connected with their community. And so this legislation, it has, I guess it's got 3 purposes. And you can read it right in the Act. It's, you know, very straightforward. It's on page 2, if anybody wants to read along. The purpose of this Act is to recognize that barriers impact all persons in Alberta, particularly persons with disabilities. Persons with disabilities must be involved in the development and design of laws, policies, programs, services, and structures that impact their full and effective participation and inclusion in society on an equal basis with others. Persons with disabilities have rights and freedoms, including those stated in the Alberta Human Rights Act and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, including the right to equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination on the basis of disability. And under the UN Convention ratified by Canada in 2010, Canada has committed to take appropriate measures to ensure accessibility, and Alberta supports that commitment. So if Alberta supports the commitment, I'm sure that there will be no difficulty with any of the members on the other side voting in favour of this bill. You know, this is really supporting the human rights of people living with disabilities. It is very fundamental, and it is about us in Alberta having an inclusive society. So that's sort of the first purpose. The second one is to create an accessible Alberta by 2040 by identifying, preventing, and removing barriers to the establishment of accessibility standards. And the third is to provide for the involvement of persons with disabilities and individuals and organizations that serve or work on behalf of persons with disabilities in the development of accessibility standards. So that last one is a very fundamental thing. If you're creating legislation, it's always very important to include the people that legislation impacts. Because otherwise, a lot of times, the people who are sitting around those tables, the policy tables, if they don't have people who are experiencing these kind of challenges, then they're not thinking through the whole understanding of what they need, how they're impacted by that. And so that's why when you are making policy, it's so important to have a diverse group of individuals around that table, making those decisions, people with lived experience, maybe academics, people who have studied this area.
Member for Sherwood Park.
Mr. Speaker, when we gather in this legislature, we are entrusted with the responsibility of shaping the kind of society Alberta will become. We debate budgets. In the last few years, a lot of deficit budgets. We pass laws. We argue about priorities. But at the heart of all of this is a much bigger question. What kind of province do we want to build together? I believe we should always strive to make Alberta a place where every person has the opportunity to thrive. A province that is not only prosperous but inclusive. A province where our communities are strong because everyone can participate fully in them. That is why I rise today in support of Bill 206, the Accessible Alberta Act, a thoughtful piece of legislation brought forward by the MLA for St. Albert. Yeah, hear, hear. This legislation sets an ambitious but necessary goal, creating a barrier-free Alberta by the year 2040. It proposes a standard-based approach to identifying, preventing, and removing barriers that limit participation for people with disabilities. Mr. Speaker, this is not a radical idea. In fact, Alberta is behind. Accessible legislation already exists in 8 other provinces and at the federal level through the Accessible Canada Act. That federal law established a national framework for developing accessibility standards and set the same goal, a barrier-free Canada by 2040. We need to bring this legislation to Alberta. Under that framework, organizations such as government departments, crown corporations, and federally regulated industries must develop accessible plans and report on their progress towards removing barriers. Bill 206 follows a similar path with our province. It would bring Alberta in line with the rest of the country and give us the tools to systematically identify barriers, whether they existed in buildings, digital services, employment practices, transportation systems, or public programs, and remove them. An example of low curbs mentioned by the MLA for Lethbridge West is such a great example of how working on accessibility in this province benefits everyone. Accessibility doesn't happen by accident. It happens through thoughtful design, deliberate policy, and clear standards. True accessibility requires listening to the people who experience barriers every day. Their knowledge must shape the solutions. Bill 206 recognizes that principle of ensuring people with disabilities are part of the process and develops accessibility standards. And Mr. Speaker, it's worth noting that when the government ignores the principle The consequences are real. We have seen in this recently with the government's decision to overhaul the Assured Income for Severely Handicapped, AISH program, and transition people into the Alberta Disability Assistance Program, a program that many disability advocates say happened without proper consultation and will result in lower benefits for thousands of Albertans. And advocates like Bean Gill and Zachary Weeks, and I'm so glad they are here today. That is precisely why the principle of nothing about us without us matters. And I know the MLA for St. Albert included the people with disabilities and the advocates in the creation of this legislation. Mr. Speaker, accessibility is not just a matter of fairness, it's also a matter of opportunity. And the Alberta Chambers of Commerce, they understand this. In fact, the chambers, including Sherwood Park Chamber of Commerce, released a policy proposal calling on the government to implement accessibility legislation in Alberta. Yep. Because businesses recognize that inclusive workplaces expand the labour pool and strengthen the economy. And that matters right now. We're running a deficit budget. We could use more people making more income in this province. This government has run out of ideas of how to balance the provincial budget. Income tax is still its largest source of revenue. If the UCP didn't waste so much money on their pet projects and help more people work, they'd help Alberta balance its budget again. Mr. Speaker, we see the value of this work every day in communities across Alberta. In my own community of Sherwood Park, we are fortunate to have organizations that demonstrate that inclusive society, what inclusive society looks like in practice. And one of those organizations is the Robin Hood Association. And for decades, Robin Hood has been a part of our community. It has worked to support people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, helping ensure that every individual has the opportunity to live a full life, contribute to their community, and simply have a great day. That's the motto of the Robin Hood Association. Their work strengthens families, it strengthens communities, and it reminds us that inclusion, what it truly looks like. Another remarkable organization in Sherwood Park is Winder Inclusive Community Service. They support neurodivergent adults by helping build meaningful relationships, develop confidence, and create fulfilling lives. Their work is about empowerment, about ensuring that individuals are recognized as valued members of their communities and have the opportunity to shape their own futures. Organizations like these are doing the work of building an accessible Alberta. What Bill 206 does is ensure our laws catch up with the values that many communities are already living. Mr. Speaker, in a few weeks, I'll attend the Robin Hood Association Empowerment Gala in Sherwood Park. April 9th, I invite everyone to buy a ticket, buy a table, support the Robin Hood Association. And I would love to be able to stand in that room and tell the people, the families, the advocates, the staff, and the individuals whose lives are touched by their work that this legislature passed Bill 206. That Alberta chose to join the rest of Canada in committing to a barrier-free society in 2040. That we recognize accessibility not as an afterthought, but as a foundational part of building a great society. Because when we remove barriers, we invite more people in. More people into our workplaces, more people into our schools, more people into our communities, and when everyone can participate fully, Alberta becomes stronger, more innovative, and more compassionate. That is the kind of province we should be striving to build, a great society, one where everyone belongs and thrives. Mr. Speaker, I encourage all members of this House to support Bill 206, the Accessible Alberta Act. Thank you.
I'll recognize the member for Edmonton City Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honour to rise here today on behalf of my many constituents who live with a disability to show my support for Bill 206. I want to thank my colleague, the member for St. Albert, for bringing this forward. I dare say, Mr. Speaker, no member of this House enjoys more trust and respect from the members of the disability community than the member from St. Albert. There is no one in this House who has spent more time in consultation with, listening to, and representing the voices of Albertans who live with a disability than that member. And that is echoed on every page of Bill 206. You know, Mr. Speaker, I would say the majority of us in this place have no understanding of what it is to live with a disability in a society and an environment that is not built for you. I have maybe a small understanding. Mr. Speaker, in 2012, I developed multiple chemical sensitivity, which means that I am affected by artificial scents and perfumes and by chemicals in the environment. And you don't realize how much that exists, how many artificial scents and perfumes there are, how many people wear heavy cologne, how many chemicals you run into in your environment, until the fact that running into them makes you sick, makes you painfully aware. It takes a lot of conscious thought and effort to navigate the world thinking about that, trying to avoid it. I've been fortunate that I've had workplaces and that in fact did have accommodations, scent-free spaces that made it much easier for me to be able to continue to participate in the way that everyone else can do. But there are still spaces I can't go into. There are places where I need accommodations to be able to participate. That is what people living with a disability live with every single day at an exponentially higher level of difficulty than I'll ever know. And Bill 206 is just about trying to correct that balance. It's a simple thing. But unfortunately, what we heard today from the member for Camrose is this government refuses to do even that simplest of steps. Putting forward basic accessibility legislation. You know, the member for Camrose spent quite a bit of time reading the lists in which the government patted itself quite heartily on the back, claiming Alberta is not standing still on accessibility, trying to claim that their nominal increases on services and supports for Albertans with a disability at a time of record inflation and population growth is somehow a heroic feat. It's not, Mr. Speaker. It's the bare minimum to even be considered even remotely competent and ethical in governing. It's the bare minimum. She talked about, $250 million to help folks with a disability to gain, maintain meaningful employment. Meanwhile, this government is clawing back millions more from those very same Albertans that they've received through the Canada Disability Benefit. This government has no claim to pat itself on the back, Mr. Speaker, perhaps to hang its head in shame, especially as we hear today that they intend to vote down and vote against this legislation. They talk about building and safety codes. Again, Mr. Speaker, that is the bare minimum. The member from Camrose talked about how concerned they are about the impacts of this legislation. Let's be clear, Mr. Speaker, this is the most interventionist government Albertans have ever seen. Yeah. Yes. They've got their fingers in everything. They throw their weight around without a care for how it impacts everyday Albertans, for how it drives investment away, how it affects business, how it affects Albertans who live with a disability. In fact, the claims that were put forward by the member for Camrose, I'd say on behalf of the government, are wildly inaccurate. I think rooted in the worst possible faith reading of what's actually in the bill and making many claims about things that actually aren't there at all. For example, this bill would not affect private industry. It's not mentioned. It's not covered by anything in this bill. Yet the member for Camrose claimed it was. The government tried to say, well, hey, only 3 provinces actually have fully developed accessibility standards. I mean, hey, Alberta's not that bad. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, this Bill 206 would simply bring Alberta in line with the 8 other provinces that already have accessibility standards. And let's be clear, the UCP love to point to practices in other provinces when it benefits them. If it means they get to give themselves bigger gifts, or bigger salaries for their MLAs, more money for their parliamentary secretaries, when they want to cut the supports that Alberta government pays to some of the most marginalized Albertans, they are very happy to look to other provinces and try to adopt what they're doing. They love to race to the bottom, Mr. Speaker. But when it comes to a simple accommodation to introduce accessibility legislation, all of a sudden, no, Mr. Speaker, we can't do what other provinces do. You know, Mr. Speaker, according to the 2022 Canadian Survey on Disability, conducted by this government, I would note, 27.5% of Albertans aged 15 and over, approximately 906,100 people at that time, reported having one or more disabilities. That number has only increased in the 4 years since, Mr. Speaker. But you know, it's really interesting. You can tell a lot about who a government likes, who they're listening to, by what they're actually willing to do. Alberta separatists, Mr. Speaker, now they get multiple pieces of legislation. Support in their court case, commitment of tens of millions of Alberta's taxpayer dollars in their quest to tear Alberta out of Canada. That's what this government is willing to do for them. There are more Albertans living with a disability, Mr. Speaker, than Albertans who support separatism. I just read the numbers. But this government is not even willing to pass a simple private member's bill to support and help them. Because it doesn't benefit the government, Mr. Speaker. Pandering to separatists does. The Premier has said so. Helps her keep her political party together, helps them cling to power. That's what this government acts on, not what is actually ethically right, not what would be good for our economy, not what would be good for Alberta. Strangely quiet in the House now, Mr. Speaker. Should be. You know, the member for Camrose said she believes that when it comes to this government working to improve accessibility for Albertans with disabilities, they need to do it properly. Mr. Speaker, I would dare say that when it comes to improving accessibility for Albertans with disabilities, I'd like to see this government simply do anything at all. But they're not. They're dragging their feet. They're pursuing things Albertans do not want. I bet if you went out and actually talked to Albertans, if they had maybe taken this out on their Alberta Next town hall tour, they would have heard an awful lot of Albertans that would have supported legislation like this and those supports for the disability community. But they don't ask those questions because they don't want to hear the things they don't want to do. And the fact is, Mr. Speaker, we have members of the disability community here in the gallery today. They have been calling out. This government's own disability advocate wrote the report with the recommendation to do precisely what the member for St. Albert has done. And this government has told us they're about to vote it down. So, Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment.
Yeah, it's a good one. You'll like it. Yeah.
Just let me know, Mr. Speaker, when I'm able to speak to it.
Members, this amendment will be referred to as REF 1.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Basically, in short, this would send the bill to the Standing Committee for Families and Communities so that we could actually hear from the community. It's clear this government has not been listening to the members of the disability community, does not wish to listen to them. We are giving them one last chance to do that. I don't want to see this bill slowed down and being passed, but if it means that we stop this government from killing this bill, either today or next week, sending it to committee, giving them the chance to actually hear from members of the public, members of the disability community, who would tell them how essential, how crucial this legislation is. I think that's an important step, and it's something that we owe to every Albertan before the government makes this rash decision. So, Mr. Speaker, look forward to an opportunity to see if the government members are going to step up, actually listen to their constituents, and support Albertans who live with disabilities. Thank you.
Okay, any members wishing to speak to the amendment REF 1? Any members wishing to speak? I'll recognize the member for Calgary-Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am excited to speak a little bit to the amendment proposed by the member from Edmonton Centre and further to Bill 206, which is brought forward by the member from St. Albert. I'm very excited about the opportunity to move this bill to committee so that we can have some real consultation from community. I would like to applaud the member from St. Albert for her work as a champion, which has made an impression on me and so many other Albertans long before I ever became a member of this chamber. And I'd also like to highlight that this bill could not have been brought forward without deep consultative work, and especially not without the contributions by the disability community and advocates, and look forward to debating it more.
Thank you.
Any other members wishing to speak to the amendment? Seeing none, all those in favour of the amendment, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. No. The amendment is defeated and a division has been called.
Honourable members, a division has been called on an amendment to Private Members Bill 206. The division is RAF 1. If you are in favour of the amendment, please now stand.
The Honourable Member Hoffman, Member Callahoo-Stonehouse, Mr. Shepherd, Mr. Haji, the Honourable Mr. Guthrie, Member Kayende, Ms. Renaud, Member Hoyle, Mr. Kozowski, Member Irwin, Member Tejada, Ms. Hayter, Member Beauperai, Ms. Goring, the Honourable Member Ceci, Mr. Dack, the Honourable Ms. Laurie Sigurdsson, Member Miyashiro.
Honourable members, if you are opposed to the amendment, please now stand.
The Honourable Mr. Sigurdsson, the Honourable Mr. Nicolaides, the Honourable Mrs. Sawney, the Honourable Mr. Williams, the Honourable Mr. Glubish, the Honourable Minister LaGrange, the Honourable Mr. Horner, the Honourable Mr. Scow, the Honourable Mr. Ellis, the Honourable Mr. Amory, the Honourable Mr. Lowen, the Honourable Mr. Wilson, the Honourable Mr. Jean, the Honourable Mr. Dreesen, the Honourable Mr. Nixon, the Honourable Ms. Schultz, Mr. Rosewell, the Honourable Mr. Turton, the Honourable Mr. Yassine, the Honourable Ms. Furr, the Honourable Mr. Jones, the Honourable Mr. Hunter, Mr. Wright, the Honourable Mr. Nally, the Honourable Mr. Long, the Honourable Mr. McDougall, the Honourable Mr. Boychenko, Mr. Stefan, Mr. Van Dyken, Ms. Pitt, the Honourable Ms. Armstrong-Hominack, Mrs. Johnson, Mr. Weeb, Mrs. Sawyer, Mrs. Petrovic, Mr. Lunty, Mr. Dick, Mr. Yao, Mr. Sear, Ms. DeYoung, Mr. Bouchard, Mr. Singh, Ms. Lovely.
Mr. Speaker, total for the Amendment 18, total against 43.
The amendment is defeated. Back to the main motion. The Honourable Member for Calgary-Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I'd like to applaud the Herculean efforts from the member for St. Albert to leave no stone unturned and to present us with legislation, Bill 206, which was born from community contributions and deep consultation. I'd also like to address the courageous and tenacious advocates that are here today, who are incredibly brave and determined. Some of the folks who are near and dear to me, I applaud you for your tireless advocacy, for the burden that you have carried in spite of this government and their refusal to create accessibility legislation. And I'd like you to know that in addition to the mighty member from St. Albert, every one of us here as members of the Alberta NDP caucus stands with you, commits to both amplifying your voices and actively listening. We are here with you. And now I know that in the conversations around accessibility legislation, they're focused on a lot on folks with disabilities, but what Bill 206 does is really universal. It benefits us all. There is an inevitability in our lives as humans that at some point we may need the world around us to be more accessible. Our homes, jobs, and so many other ways in which we interact with the world. I've heard it phrased that at any time, any one of us could become a member of the disability community, especially as we know that our senior population is the most rapidly growing part of the population, and Bill 206 takes actual measures and creates the standards that we need for aging communities as well. We will always consult with Albertans with disabilities about the decisions that directly impact their day-to-day lives, and as we've seen from the harmful changes to age eligibility, the forced ADAP legislation, and pocketing of the disability benefit from the UCP, Alberta's New Democrats believe in having your back, not clawbacks. We believe in removing barriers, not creating them. The UCP has had 7 years to present legislation. They had a UCP-appointed advocate deliver a report recommending standalone and wide-ranging accessibility legislation that focuses on a proactive approach, and they have absolutely failed to do that. And as we've seen with this government, their modus operandi is to take the community's recommendations and sit on them.
Honourable member, I hesitate to interrupt, but the time for consideration of this item of business has now concluded.
Under motions other than government motions, motion other than a government motion 507, Mr. Sinclair.
The honourable member from Lesser Slave Lake.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise today to speak in support of motion 507. I'm also incredibly proud that this is the first motion I've tabled in this House, hopefully not my last, although, thank you. If it happens to be, Mr. Speaker, I'd be perfectly fine knowing that the